Welcome to Gin and Tantra.
Thanks for tuning in Ginandtantra. In this episode titled, What Do You Think? We discuss and kind of define biological materialism, secular humanism, and specifically their takes on the difficulties that we face in this lifetime. We ask the question, what do you think? We also discuss phenomenology, which in itself is a fantastic word that I love to say. But more specifically, we highlight some of the tools that these modern philosophies apply as a salve to ease the wounds of the modern material matrix we call today. Enjoy the episode.
Hey, fellow Gianteers, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist. So after a little short hiatus, Daniel and I are back, and we're here to talk about suffering, as we've been talking about for weeks. But we're really doing something we hope is different. Normally, when you talk about this subject matter, you just go through and you kind of present some Buddhist stuff, which we did. But our idea was to also go through and kind of look at like how other schools of thought, traditions of thought think about this question. Because probably in the West, for most people, Buddhism isn't your introduction to this. You've already been thinking about this some way or another relative to other parts of the culture. So it seemed like a deeper way to go through this. And it does connect to a richer tradition, Buddhist kind of a thing where you go through and you look at like the view. And in this case, we're not talking about Whoopi Goldberg. Is it Joy Behar? You know who's even on that show?
Yeah,
Joy Behar, right?
Joy Behar.
Megan McCain is gone, right?
Megan McCain is gone. Yeah, much to the disappointment of her massive audience, I'm sure.
Did she get kicked off for some reason?
I don't know, dude.
We don't know. We don't know.
She got a job working at My Pillow, I guess. I don't know.
You have to do it. You're not gonna get that information we have. We don't have that information.
Yeah.
So it's not that. Like when you talk about the view in Eastern thought, certainly in like Tantric Buddhist thought, it's usually like where these Tantric Buddhist folks are going through and they're kind of saying, okay, here's how people tend to think within this culture, right? And I want to get the one, where it's one of the guys from Tibet who went to China. Well, almost do that before we do our Taoism episode. But anyways, there's this whole idea of just describing how people think. So we wanted to do that. Go through and look and say, okay, here's how Christianity might talk about this, or here's how Islam or Judaism. We did the big three. We talked about some New Age stuff. We did some Gnostic stuff in addition to the Buddhist stuff. And today it's, I think, one of the, really most important, but like, as I was trying to like do some prep on it, like one of the most confusing things to talk about, which is just sort of like biological materialism, secular humanism, and talk about like how that mindset thinks about suffering. And I was trying to think about how to prep this, Daniel, from my part. And I was like, well, the thing that's hardest for me was something like, first of all, how many people have this point of view? And you and I were talking like off mic right before we were starting, and it's probably a lot. You looked at the stats, people who identify as non-religious were like
about a third.
About a third
in this
right?
country, in the
United States. Yeah, but like, then we were also kind of throwing the idea like it might be more people who just, they wouldn't necessarily say they're atheists or something, but this is, if you really scratch beneath the surface, this is how people think.
Sure.
So it's partially a question of like, how many people are we talking about? And then like, what exactly do people believe? Because if you're going to do a real good description of like what people think and then how they would think about suffering, you have to sort of know what people think. And it's not that obvious to me what the hell people think.
Right.
Yeah. So anyways, those are my confusions around this. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, I could say, I mean, I think after, we're not going to go into it, but after the 2016 election, we could say that polling data isn't the best anymore,
Okay. Yeah, that's fair.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So we could say that at least a third of people are quote unquote non-religious. And then based on the ones that are religious, what percent of them feel some sort of way to just check Christian or whatever based on their parents' affiliation, you know what I'm saying? And don't actually carry any practices or ideology with them, but just will put down, yes, I'm religious from this perspective, but maybe who are never baptized or their kids are never put into any sort of religious affiliation. I think that number is,
it's like kind of like cultural, right?
It's
culturally
cultural.
This or that. Yeah.
Right. But for all intents and purposes, you're not like praying before you eat and, you know what I'm saying, asking for guidance from your creator wherever that creator exists. So I think it's actually a much larger part of the population. And I'm looking forward to kind of going into this a little bit, because I do think its voice is growing, even though it may not necessarily have that much of a voice culturally, because the religious, and I'll just call it the religious right at this point, is taking all the room, or taking all the air out of the room, or maybe putting hot air in the room. I don't know, but there's a room and there's air, and I don't like all of it together.
Some of the air is a little stale.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think some of the conversation has moved in that direction, and those who are not on the boat at all are kind of like, where do we fit in with all of this?
Yeah, there is kind of a weird feeling of like, I know a lot of people are asking this question of, where do I fit in now into these conversations? People don't know where they fit in, which, again, might be something we'll talk about as a cause of suffering too, in a way, not knowing where you fit in. But I also think it kind of matters like what people actually believe, not even what you might check on a form,
right,
for statistical purposes, but if you really like, because to get the Buddhism of this, or to get the psychospirituality of this, you have to know like what the person actually thinks, not what they just sort of like maybe would put out as like a census form thing, or something like that. It really matters like what you actually think,
and therein lies the issue with the polling.
And trying to like even get to like what the underlying thing that people actually think and believe is kind of hard. So I guess in a way, my sense of Americans would be something like, a lot of them are probably biological materialists without even really knowing what that is, or really like, self-identifying in that way. They probably just are, just maybe by default or just de facto. Does that seem fair to say? Or like, what do you think? I mean, you're going to get people who are religious in the way, they strongly identify. But I think a lot of people, when you get underneath the surface, they're just sort of like that.
I would say so.
That kind of matches my experience, especially for a lot of people who would kind of like not think too deeply about these things.
And just for our, I'm going to do a little definition here, right? So we can have that as our working in our background, right?
Yeah. Word of the day, phrase of the day.
So word of the day, materialism is a tradition of thought in which all things that exist are made up of matter in some way, right? So everything is made up of matter. Matter, even though matter is a form of energy, everything has some component to it, Yeah,
I don't think people think about the physics energy stuff. We've done podcasts about physics, and physics is weird. I don't think people think about the universe in some weirdo physics way.
No, they don't think about it in some way. It's Newtonian. It's Newtonian physics from that perspective.
I think they're mostly in the Darwinism.
There's that. But either way, biological,
mostly in the Darwinism.
Biological materialism is as it sounds, right? It's made up of stuff. Stuff is made of stuff. And the question from where that stuff is made up of doesn't get asked. Stop asking, just accept what you see. That is the end of it. If your eyes cannot perceive it, it does not exist. Oh shit, what's an X-ray? Never mind.
How does that work?
Right? Never mind. I'm talking on a wireless black box, Oh yeah, never mind. Forget about that.
Don't think about any of those waves and any of those other funky shit. So I don't know. It's been kind of a weird thing. I'm like, even with my son and my daughter, I kind of know like underneath the surface, just by being raised in this culture, this is probably what you're going to think, unless you're specifically probably raised Christian or something. In some much more intense way. So we're probably talking about a big group of people, and probably like a view of the world which is not like super well defined, like where people probably don't know what they think. And you might say, well, why have this conversation? The thing is, like, probably if you're just raised in West, again, we're looking at America because that's what we know, but maybe Western culture overall. If you're just like raised in this culture, you probably just sort of think this way just by default. Some semi-vague sense of like something about Darwin and natural selection, and something about a platypus that and how it doesn't quite fit right, but it still is there, and some shit that you've heard about this and your upbringing. You're like, well, okay, I guess this is how I think about the world, and my cell phone works, so science must be true. And I don't know, whatever you think, there's some hodgepodgey way of looking at the world this way.
Well, and that's kind of like, I think what we were alluding to earlier in terms of the surveys, and that like how people think and what they're going to share with the world are not always congruent. right? Number one. But then number two, and we always talk about our mission statement, but really this is a perfect place for it, is to be able to question a lot of this unconscious programming. And we don't really use those words very much because it has a conspiratorial sort of feeling to it. So I know I steer clear of it. Eric, I don't know if you steer clear of it, but I think it's kind of,
it is unconscious and it is programming. It's not inaccurate. Do you know what I mean?
Right. But we can say that like there is unconscious and conscious cultural programming. Sometimes that cultural programming is great. It comes from your mom or your grandma, and probably from women more than men. I'm going to just say it, but be kind to people, right? Do good things, give, you know what I'm saying? That's good social, programming. Those things are fine. But there's a lot more that gets learned without words, right? Through advertising, through innuendos, through subtext, through slang, through just cultural references that are in the culture, just sort of floating around in people's minds that get passed along. And as receivers of information, all of us are going to take them in. And at some point, I believe anyways, and I think you agree, they take residence in your mind. They take residence in your body. They take residence in your heart. And therefore, they take residence in your thoughts and actions. Much below the level of your awareness, actually. And so one of the things that we are definitely doing here on purpose is to highlight as many of those things as possible and say, is that you? Is that what you think? Is that what you believe? Is that what you want to be inside of you? And I say no for now, but maybe I'll put it back.
Well, the thing that's funny about it in the end would be maybe there's like a joint project to go through and try to figure out like what it is people actually think. I'm like imagining like these Tibetan old school scholars or Indian scholars sitting in some other place that they didn't know, and they got their little notepad out and they're trying to write down like, what do these people actually think? Maybe that's the hardest thing to figure out with Americans in a way, is what the fuck do we actually think? Because it's not so obvious on some level. It's some kind of weird set of things that you probably think underneath the surface. And I imagine, again, you have to like, from a psychospiritual point of view, from like a Buddhist point of view, because this episode started with a Buddhist sort of theme about dukkha and dissatisfaction, suffering, or however you want to translate that. You end up with this question of you need to be able to know what you actually think so you can challenge those views and start to grow and develop them in ways that might be more healthy.
Correct.
So maybe that is something that we'll have to just keep working on as this endeavor goes forward. Because I'm not entirely sure. When I look at my brother, as an example, he's obviously a biological materialist. If you asked him, But actually, maybe if you didn't ask him, if I asked him, are you a biological materialist? I don't even know if he would agree with that. But if you were digging around in his mind, I'm sure he is. It's strange. It's a strange problem. So anyway, so this is this question of view, right? It's just this whole thing of what is this actually? Like, what do people actually believe in the surface? And I don't know if the tenets are very clear. I think there's probably a lot of confusion about what people actually think. That was my problem in trying to prep this even. I was like, okay, what do people think? Can we even like say this very clearly? And I don't think we can. And probably if we were trying to say what people think, you'd only capture like a certain number of people. You'd miss other people who don't quite think that or something. But there's something weird going on and trying to figure out what it is actually that people think. Like if I really ask my daughter, like, what do you actually think? I think on some level she'd just be like, I don't know.
Well, I think
she doesn't know.
And I also think though that the response to that question probably gives more credence, more, I guess, insight into someone's mind, and they would probably say, about what?
I mean, maybe.
Because I ask this question all the time. What do you think? Just, to my friends, my partner, what do you think? And they'll be like, about what? And I'm like, I don't know, anything. And it's always, but I mean, the thing is, right? Oh man, this is even a deeper question. Is thought relative?
Relative to what?
Exactly. Right. So
about what?
Right. So if you ask what does someone think, they have to about what,
Oh, I see what you mean.
Do you see what I'm saying? I'm going meta on this shit,
But the thing is, like, you wouldn't ask me that question because I would answer.
Well, right.
It'd be a long answer, and you probably don't even want to like, dude, I do a whole fucking podcast with you. I don't need to hear any more of this. But I mean, that's because I actually I spent a certain amount of time trying to figure out what it is that I think.
Mm.
But I mean, and I think if I asked my daughter, she'd be like, she'd feel defensive, and it'd be anxiety inducing.
What do you mean?
What do you mean?
What are you
That would be
saying?
it. Probably like, I don't think like you would probably be part of the answer. I'd be like, okay, that's cool. You know, I don't know. It is something. It was
Well,
that was the hiccup. And like, you know, for my part of the prepping in this, I was like, I don't know if I know how to describe what people actually think.
Well, this is a great thought experiment for people listening. You know,
Yeah.
just to think about the question, what do you think? Not what do you think about, what do you think?
Well, this is kind of like, well, like, what do you think this place is? What are you up to? And like, what's the meaning of it? You know, that's obviously what we're asking.
Yeah.
And they could have all kinds of answers.
Right. Well, because in part of the question of what do you think is how do you think?
Yeah.
You know, and based on your personality, probably astrological signs, genetic makeup, upbringing, education, experience, people are going to have different ways of thinking, and thereby that's probably going to inform how they think, thereby moving us to our question, what do you think?
About what?
Exactly.
I'm just giving a response. No, but the thing is, like, what you're trying to figure out from like, you know, Buddhist tantric point of view or Asian philosophical point of view, or however you want to frame this, is like, what is your view?
Right.
Like, what is your view? You know, and the reason they do that is because it's going to change everything. It's like digging underneath the surface to go, okay, so what do you actually believe in?
So how would, you know, based on the view, or we'll say the pursuit of the view, what are some things that they might mention in the tantric texts or some of the Buddhist texts that you've read that are, I don't know, like techniques of viewing or techniques of finding how one would be in the perspective of viewing, you know, viewing the world, viewing themselves, you know, I mean, you know, there's mindfulness, there's all these kind of meditations.
This is like, I mean, if you want to use a fancy philosophical word, this is what you would call phenomenology.
Ooh.
You know, and I have like a psych background. So, you know, what you try to do is you try to figure out, okay, how does this person actually think? Like, not like maybe they're like passing thoughts about things. You know, people have all kinds of passing thoughts, but if you had to like kind of dig into the substructure of their mind or their psyche, here's how they actually see things.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what this is. And so then what has been done, you know, in a lot of these old Indian books and Tibetan books and so on, has been to go through and say, okay, this is kind of how these people phenomenologically see their world, right? And so that's what you're trying to describe, beyond like, even like what, you know, the person's like mindfulness is and what their thoughts are of the moment. The fact that you happen to be thinking, boy, do I want to continue to keep watching Stranger Things, or does this season actually suck? That's a thought you could have. But, you know, you might be like, well, you know, that doesn't tell you that much about your view of everything.
Yeah.
You know, it's something else. It's something we're trying to figure out, like, what's the underpinnings of how this person actually kind of sees their world.
As I have a definition here of phenomenology, which I quite like it. It says an approach of study that concentrates on the study of consciousness and the objects of direct experience.
Yep. It could be how you experience things in your environment, but especially how you experience your own mind and your own emotions. But like a lot of times in the psych literature, what you're trying to figure out is, how does a person with like schizotypal personality disorder experience their world? And you can like write a whole long thing about that, going, okay, here's probably how they experience and think about things, just to describe it. And so the part of like the Buddhist part that was so interesting to me is they were kind of doing something similar. I was like, okay, this is a kind of a psychology. This is how a Taoist thinks, you know? The weird part for me with the biological materialist part is some of the people that I've talked to who are definitely biological materialists, when I've asked them, they get slightly offended.
Of course, because
it's that word, but it's not offensive.
It's a description.
It's a description. But I've noticed that people don't want to be called that. People don't like to be called that. And I'm like, okay, why is it the materialist part that you don't like?
No, it's the biologic. How dare you?
what part bothers people? I've noticed that too. If you tell someone, oh, you're biological material, because I have friends who are definitely this.
Yeah.
And you go like, okay, so you're a biological materialist. That's cool. And they get like very like edgy,
Well,
anxious, and they don't want to just say that's what they are.
I think people
That's interesting too.
But I think no matter what you would tell somebody, unless they chose to be that thing on purpose, then they are probably going to have some kind of reaction to anybody telling them what they are.
Well, if that's the truth, then part of the phenomenology would be that you didn't choose that on purpose. You got kind of like backed into that. And when someone actually tells you that that's what your actual thing is, if you get offended, then that's meaningful.
Now that was worth $100. Because
for the hour of work.
That's right. Because
that was a success.
That is the truth, right? That is the truth. That this sentence, this part of our conversation now highlights the exact reason why we have these conversations, right? The exact reason. Because if someone says something, I believe personally to that exact point, if someone says something about you that might be true, but you haven't consciously chosen it, and yet it is you, you are going to feel as if it is foreign to you, and therefore I am putting something upon you that is not you, and therefore you are going to feel rejection. No, that is not me. Well, then my question is, why do you act as if it is?
That's a very interesting question. Because if someone came out to me and said, "Oh, you're very Zen," I'd be like, "Oh, thank you, thank you very much." If they said, "Yeah, you're very like tantric person, very tantric Buddhist person," like, "Oh, thank you." I take it as a compliment. I would like it. They said I'm Taoist. I'd be like, "Awesome, thanks. That's great." But so I own those things. I like them.
Now,
I kind of like myself. But if I went to my daughter and I said, "You're a biological material," she'd be like, "Bah." She wouldn't like it. Though I think she probably is.
And
which I'm not even judging.
Keep in mind, we are not labeling external appearance. We're not discussing external appearance labels. We're talking about what I believe is deeper, right? Because external is the first thing that we see, but the last thing that is manifested. What I'm referring to is someone's habituations, someone's tendencies towards thinking and acting and responding and being in the way that they're being in the world, actually.
Kind of like a substructure of how the person actually sort of is wired and how they function.
Yes. I don't want anybody to misconstrue us to say, "Oh, well, this person dresses this way, therefore they must be blank."
Biological materials are like serial killers. They look just like everybody else.
Oh, okay.
Isn't that the old joke? That's an old joke. I think it's from the M Family or something like that. You could just go out like in your Halloween costume, just normal clothes, and you're a serial killer because no one will be able to tell you. You look just like everybody else. Okay. Yeah, I mean, like, you can't tell from the surface, like, so it isn't that question for sure.
Right.
I wouldn't know like how idiosyncratically interesting, fascinating, peculiar your view of the world is just from your t-shirt and hat.
Right.
I wouldn't be able to tell that.
No.
Yeah. Just like everybody else.
So, so what we're trying to, I guess where we're trying to guide people is back towards the contents of their own thinking processes, and on one level, but then on the next sort of level, not just the processes, but like the act of all the processes interacting together. What
maybe like this moment where you take a second and you go like, okay, what do I actually think? Like you actually ask yourself that question. Like, what do I actually think? What do I like for reals? Can I describe what it is that I think and believe? Maybe try to do it because I think it's confusing for people.
And this goes back to our earlier point about there's so much that influences what and how you think. I mean,
this is your unconscious programming thing.
Which of those aspects have you agreed to, right? What have you said yes to
without even knowing you really did it?
Yeah. And which ones have you consciously said yes to? So if you you said you have a psych background, you have consciously agreed with your materials and your teachers and yourself to say, okay, I'm going to approach the world with this as part of my lens and the way that which I see it, but I don't know how many people have actually done that outside of, the agreements in their own cultural references, what their parents have given them, what TV shows have given them, or, outside conversations, influences, and I think it's really important actually, because without that, we are automatons in a sense, like
there's a danger of that.
Yeah.
There's a danger of that.
and not like in a, go ahead.
Well, no, it's interesting to me in terms of like self-esteem too, if you get to
Yeah.
the psychology, because like if someone says to me something, it's like if you went to the psychology thing and someone says, oh, you really sound like you like Carl Rogers or something. I'm like, yes, I do. And I feel like good about that. Like that label doesn't make me feel bad about myself, and I don't feel a need to resist it or something like that. So I wonder if it doesn't change people's sense of self-esteem somehow. I don't know.
It would seem to be that, at least in my way of thinking, that like the more things that you would agree to, that you would be empowered by those things because you believe that they have value. So you're allowing those things to infuse your body, mind, heart, soul, whatever, with value. And thereby all the actions that you have are coming from places of value, not places of kind of like confusion.
What's weird about that too, maybe would be something like if someone came up and said, well, you're a biological materialist and a neoliberal and like a kind of like a consumer capitalist, aren't you? I'd be like, no. And most people, if you said that to them, they'd be like, no,
right,
I'm not that. But like secretly, that might be the most accurate description of what you're like.
Correct.
If that's the case, in terms of suffering, you probably have a problem. Because if the most accurate way of describing you makes you feel really bad about yourself, then you get a problem. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah, it's something. Okay. So I guess we did the best we could with this.
We did.
And maybe the thing in the end is just like maybe asking the question of like, okay, let me take a step back and see what it is that I actually think. Yeah. Okay. So what about suffering in this view? All right. So I had what I've been trying to do with this a little bit is to ask like an archetypal person who holds this kind of way of seeing things to ask them like, well, what do you think suffering is about? Or what's your reaction? What would you say? I did this for someone I know who self-identifies as Taoist. So I will save that for our Taoism conversation, but people people have answered, So I asked a friend who would probably identify as like secular humanist. And he's a big fan of like the writer Kurt Vonnegut, who wrote like Slaughterhouse-Five and Cat's Cradle, if you know these books. Anyways, and so he's probably like a famous like sort of like secular humanist writer and really good writer. If you've never read him, he's worthwhile reading. He's very creative, kind of a little sci-fi, some of it, and a little fantastic, but like really creatively done. So anyways, if you haven't read Kurt Vonnegut, it might be something worthwhile looking at. But in any case, he sent me this Kurt Vonnegut quote that he felt kind of captured his way of looking at things. So he was kind of using like Kurt Vonnegut's words. And Kurt Vonnegut has this thing where he says, hello, babies. Welcome to Earth. It's hot in the summer and cold in the winter. It's round and wet and crowded. On the outside, babies, you've got like probably about 100 years here, tops. There's only one rule that I know of, babies. God damn it, you've got to be kind. That's the Kurt Vonnegut view. And I thought, okay, well, that's a nice way to put that. And that probably does reflect my friend's way of seeing the world. So what's happening here? And what I kind of went was, well, there's a way of looking at the world where you kind of see like in a biological materialist way, where there's kind of no particular reason why things happen in any deeper sense. Things happen because of cause and effect, but in kind of a rando way. There's sort of like a kind of a rando quality to natural selection, which thing survives, which things go. You can sort of figure out why something survived in the end, but there's obviously chance and randomness is a big part of this way of seeing the world. Do you agree with that too, Daniel?
Yeah.
It's pretty random. Now, as it turns out, this kind of thought was already present in ancient India long ago. And it's interesting to see that this is not like a new thing that people decided now, just within the last, however many years of the scientific revolution or something like that. People have been thinking that for a long time. There's always been people who've been going, well, there's just nature. Nature just kind of like does weird shit. And, sometimes, things are pleasant and sometimes things are shitty and things just go up and down in kind of random ways. It's a lot of times unexpected and unpredictable, and that's just how it goes. So that's, I think, part of this way of thinking. Does that make sense to you too, Daniel? I think something like that.
Yeah, because it's not like a tightrope, it's encompassing.
And you could do things that are proactive to try to like make your shit better. It's not like you're completely powerless or something, but a lot of the things that are going to happen are going to have this kind of like randomness to it.
Mhm.
But I think my friend would say this: through humanism, people can learn to alleviate suffering for themselves and others. And that would be via things like increasing knowledge, medicine, technological advances, societal improvements, psychological insights, things like that. So I guess I would see, when I was thinking about this, that's what sort of seemed to me to be sort of like a secular humanist view. That you would see the world this way. You would go, well, things are kind of random. Evolution is random. What happens is kind of random. But on the other hand, I can be a proactive person and I can try to make the world a better place for myself and others. I think that's the underlying message of the Kurt Vonnegut quote, if I were to sum it up.
Mhm.
Does that seem fair?
I think that seems good.
Okay. Accurate description?
As accurate as I can.
Good enough for the purpose of this conversation. Okay. So,
But I think you can agree with that though. Right? Regardless of your stance.
Well, so the thing that hit me about this, and it's come up a couple of times, but I got the one initiation from the Dalai Lama. I had made this promise, and when I was in the Dalai Lama's monastery in New York, that I would go if he ever did this initiation. And it's a thing to a thing called the Kalachakra Tantra. Dalai Lama does this one a lot. And one of the things in the Kalachakra Tantra is the idea that as a tantric Buddhist person, using that as kind of like the discussion point here, but I'm sure as a Taoist or other traditions too, you try to learn as much as you can about the world around you and whatever people understand in the most contemporary way too, not just in some old traditional ways. But you're supposed to understand everything as best you can, because then you're going to be able to be in a better position to alleviate more of the immediate causes of human problems, difficulties, and sufferings, stuff like that. So that is like, again, specifically part of the Kala Chakra. I think it's fair to say that, that you're supposed to like try to do that. So I think I would agree just because of that. I could still have my, tantric way of seeing things, but I don't have any problem with any of those ideas. That all sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we agree. So then what about suffering specifically then? And the thing that occurred to me next was just, okay, so part of the way of handling suffering is probably like within like mental health and how the culture tries to deal with suffering there. And the thing that jumped out most clearly to me then to talk about was probably like pharmaceuticals a little bit. And a lot of the way the suffering is trying to be dealt with now, some of it through like talk therapy and through other ways, but a lot of it's sort of like through like pharmaceutical cures then, because you go through and you medically investigate. And like one of the dominant things that's happened is just this explosion of trying to like medicate people out of suffering. So I think that's something that has to be talked about here. And I was looking to try to find the percentages of people on like antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds post-pandemic, and those are kind of hard numbers to find. It's weird. They're not as readily available as what you would think. I've tried to look, and you just get different figures about increases and decreases, and they didn't look very consistent from like source to source. But in any case, we know that it's gone up over the time of the pandemic, and it was pretty high anyways. So it seems like you're looking now.
Yeah, I'm just looking.
Yeah, I don't know. I found it to be hard to get like something. You figure it would just pop up and you get some very clear thing. Because I've seen like figures that go as high as 40% of American women in their 40s and above are on antidepressants for various reasons. They're not always just for depression. Sometimes those things are used off label. But do you think it's fair to bring up this issue? Because I think like that's one of the dominant ways of trying to handle human suffering now. I think one of the dominant ways is trying to medicate people out of it.
Yeah. So I don't
in this way of thinking.
I don't even know. Yeah, no. In this way of thinking, in a biologic materialist way of thinking, this is I think, one of a few ways of intervention. We're going to say intervention as a means of therapy for I don't know, the society's attempt to alleviate suffering, right?
So you can do like certain kinds of like psychotherapy still, but psychotherapy is kind of dead on some level.
It is,
In
but
a weird way. It's more like shorter term interventions, cognitive behavioral stuff. Maybe you try to like PTSD treatment some people or something, and then you try to medicate people out.
but I wouldn't, I don't know, isolate mental health as its own animal. I'm gonna just put health together, because to me they're not. It's still an issue of patient and practitioner relationship, and how it is that you're gonna go about and alleviating their, I don't know, discomfort, or dissatisfaction in a sense, right? Because the same gets done with pain, right? And it's far more popular now, with all of the opioid addiction and all of the overprescription, which to me is the same bat. We're talking the same batch of, not same batch of people, but physical suffering, mental suffering. And what's the way through? A pill. And what does this pill do? It varies on person to person, but this is the mode in which they are trying to work through. And for me, if you need it, you take it. There's no judgment. That's how, if you have pain, you had injury, you have surgery, you have whatever, you take what you need to take in order to get through it. However, there is there's not no, but there is not a readily available other step after that. Everything else requires effort from the person. And the system doesn't make the person's effort. It doesn't reflect the person's efforts very easily. So if you want to get physical therapy, you have to get a referral, and then you have to go there, and you got to do it yourself. It's the ease of prescription, right? Convenience is very high. And unfortunately, I think the response from it is also very low, because it doesn't cause a person to put willpower into the thing after the initial kind of bump after the initial high is gone, or the initial bump of whatever pharmaceutical you're taking is gone. Even on mental health, I have a couple of friends who are psych nurses, and so they have to administer medications for some of their patients who really need them,
Yeah, it's not like a way of like saying that to people who need medications, they should take it. That's
no,
not the issue.
definitely take it. But then okay, once you're quote unquote stable, you're back to, within normal limits, as we use in medical terms, okay, now what? Actually the therapy matters more now moving forward than it did even before, because you have to try and integrate your new sort of way of thinking, your new perspective with real life work. And I don't think it's that easy for people. So to me, this is the failure, right at this line, and this is a biological, so now we kind of crap on it, we've talked about it in a good way, but now we could dump on it, and that part of their thing, right, is to make improving society by creating a medicine, and that's good, it helps, but it doesn't change the person intrinsically, and that is, to me, that is something that I don't think a materialist would really invest in, actually.
Well, this is why this was such a weird little part of this whole set of conversations to try to put together, because eventually you're thinking, okay, so what exactly is being said here? And it is confusing, because in part I could naturally, what you were talking about, you could either go to sort of the psych med part of this, but you're right, it's better to frame it as a total solution. And the total solution is, let's medicalize something, right? Which can be both positive and negative for the people who need that stuff. This could be very positive, but obviously this is a tendency to medicalize everything in this way, right? And pharmaceuticalize everything. And obviously there's major financial interests in doing that. Yeah. So, if you want to put the whole thing together, but I couldn't get away from that, is that the next, that seems logically to be the next thing to talk about. You have to talk about the medicalization of things. Yeah. And this is when you kind of analyze it practically, I guess, this is sort of how this has played itself out. Right. And it's not so much again, there are still, other therapeutic approaches that aren't pharmaceutical and, these medical interventions of this type, but this does seem to be the dominant way to try to solve the problem within the culture. If you'd have to ask, well, how are you going to solve the problem of suffering in American culture? You're going to try to drug it away.
You're going to try and drug it, and
you're going to try to drug it away. I think that's probably true. Does that seem fair, or am I being over the top with that?
No, I think that's right. And thereby, this is, for me, this is how you're in a biological materialistic view of society, because you're using biological materials to improve other biological materials.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And now sometimes that works, and sometimes that's what they need, but not everybody needs the same thing, right? And sometimes it is not a biological material problem. Sometimes it is a spiritual problem. And the biological materials do not address, in my opinion, majority of the time, a spiritual problem. You have to approach it in other ways. And then you can often have a material effect after you've done the kind of energetic approach, or a spiritual approach, or even the psychological approach. I'll put that in kind of like a middle ground,
Well, I feel like the old school psychology was more secular humanist in the sense of the Kurt Vonnegut quote, or something deeper. There was something deeper in psychology, like back in the day, which was like, let's help people figure out who they really are. And if we can help people figure out, that's the Carl Rogers psychology that I sometimes bring up in the episodes. Let's help people figure out who they really are, and then they'll feel less anxious and they'll feel less depressed because they know who they really are.
Right.
Which is obviously a different solution than like, let's just drug this shit away. Right. And I feel like in the contests between these two approaches, I think the druggy approach won. That's just the truth of it. And I don't know, I can't see it any other way, which made this a really weird thing to try to put together, because it felt like, okay, how is suffering supposed to be addressed? You're right. If it's physical suffering, we're supposed to like drug it away some way or another. And if it's psychological suffering, we're supposed to like drug it away some way or another. And that's probably the dominant idea. So I guess we agree on that, right? Yeah. And so I don't know. I was trying to figure out like, well, so how much of this is being done? And obviously it's been done a lot, but it's been very hard to tell like post-pandemic, like even what's happening. But I did stumble across this thing from Boston University School of Public Health. Excuse me. They basically said depression among adults in the United States tripled in the early 2020 months of the global coronavirus pandemic, jumping up from 8.5% before the pandemic to a staggering 27.8% during the pandemic. Okay. Now they continued the research, and they said the new research from Boston University School of Public Health reveals that the elevated rate of depression, excuse me, has persisted into 2021 and even worsened, climbing to 32.8% and affecting 1 in every 3 American adults. Okay. So, what are the sources behind? And this is like where we have the little interlude of This Culture Sucks, which is like one of my favorite themes. I snuck it in there again. But when they were doing the analysis, they were kind of talking about, problems that are hard to drug away.
Yeah. Like
you're broke. You're just flat out broke. It's hard to drug you out of your brokenness.
Correct.
You just don't have any money, or you're just lonely. Maybe because you're broke, you're also lonely, but you're lonely and you're isolated. It's hard to drug that away.
And the isolation,
but that is the solution, is you're supposed to drug it out. So I don't know. It's weird.
Well, I will, in defense of this method, which I don't want to do it, but I will do it so that people could say we're fair.
Yeah.
You're trying to remotely affect as many people as possible. Thereby, what's the way in which you can do that? Well, here, take this thing. It's going to change the way you think, feel, experience the world. Okay, goodbye. Like that's the way I can do it. But I think that because that it's so prevalent that people think that that's the stop. That's the stopping point, as opposed to that's being the beginning point, the entry point. It's like, okay, this pill should hopefully, fingers crossed, balance you. But once you have that balance, you're only balanced in the state that you're in now. You're not balanced in the totality of your existence. In
a certain sense, you're symptom repressing.
Right. And
okay, your knee is bad. So we gave you something so that you don't feel so shitty that your knee is bad. But like your knee's still going to be bad.
Correct.
Once you stop taking this shit.
And from a medical perspective, they often prescribe strong antidepressants for people with chronic pain.
Yeah, fibromyalgia patients are
correct, right? They'll give them, they give them strong, tricyclic antidepressants. Yeah, exactly. And the question is, why is that? Oh, it works well on pain. Does it? I don't know. Or does it numb people? Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, that becomes really part of the question.
And are we And are we thereby saying, well, I can't find something wrong with you, quote unquote, wrong with you. Therefore, I think it's all in between your ears, and I'm going to give you this thing to shut off whatever that is. And it's not validating for someone's experience, number one. And it doesn't help that person learn. So like you said, if someone has a torn ligament in their knee, I can give them some ibuprofen. They won't feel as bad about their knee will feel better, but the ligaments are still torn. It's not that it's, what I'm saying. And I know we could talk about the body in terms of ligaments and tendons, but we don't often refer to the mind as having,
your psyche that has a sprained this or that. But
right.
It does.
But it does. It totally does,
Yeah. That's why it's such a weird thing to try to think about, because I was thinking, okay, what is actually happening here? And it looks to me you'd have like, okay, we have this biological way of thinking about things. I think that's the predominant way of thinking in the culture, one way or the other. And you go like, well, how do you solve like what you were saying? And I think you put it very eloquently. How do I solve a biological problem? I put a biological solution. What's my biological solution? I give you something that will like change the way your biological system is functioning by making your system flood with serotonin or something like that, which will stabilize your mood or whatever the hell it is I'm trying to do. Right. And I was like, well, I guess that's the answer. Right. And then maybe you can do other things that are biologically rooted, like, try to get people to deprogram from traumatic experiences to unravel the nervous system or something. And those might be like more alternative or progressive interventions. Even that's alternative, though.
Very alternative.
Even like saying, I'll try to rewrite your nervous system a little bit by doing therapeutic approaches, that just has to be considered alternative.
And fortunately, there are more people who are taking the body approach to their mental health, which I hope that trend continues, in terms of trying to unlock somatic, body repressed emotions, feelings, experiences, because they may not be stored in the mind. They're stored in the body. There's a book that I always recommend my patients read if they have this kind of thing. I think it's called The Body Keeps Score or something like that.
Yeah, The Body Keeps the Score or something like that.
Yeah, and it's a great read for people who have this kind of physical pain or mental pain, emotional pain that has not been alleviated by, talk therapy or whatever. So it might be in the body. I mean, for me, I love the way that my yoga teacher, Andre, talks about this stuff, is that like the body is the hardware, the mind, spirit, energy is the software, but like, there's stuff on your hard drive, man. Like that's how it works genetically. There's one way there, like you didn't think, oh, I need nipples, so I better grow some, like they were there and they have things that are associated, so I don't know, it's tough. The whole thing is tough. We're not shitting on stuff.
Like trying to get to like the underlying way that the culture kind of thinks, which is going to be how the people in the culture are going to kind of think.
Yeah.
If the answer is somehow that I do something to medicate myself out of things, which is probably what the dominant approach is within this. And that can be either like, pharmaceutical, or it could be even if you're doing like smoke a bunch of weed or whatever, you're trying to medicate yourself out of something, right?
There's only two countries in the world who they direct market drug pharmaceuticals to: the United States and, strangely enough, New Zealand. Come on,
really?
Come on, Kiwis, better than that.
Don't do it. Don't do as we say, not as we do. Right.
Right. But because of that, it's a very clear example that like they are telling you, ask your doctor about this. Why? Why do my doctor should know what I need, based on what I'm telling him. Why do I need to make recommendations to not him, but their dumbass, like, oh, I didn't know about that medicine. You want it? Oh yeah, here you go. You take it. Like, I don't think that should be occurring. But my point in saying that is they'll talk about that. They'll market drugs, but they don't market for alternative therapies. There's no big marketing for like self-work. There's no marketing for psychotherapy or, psychology, psychological.
Not as much to sell.
Not as much to sell. So thereby the material approach is the predominant approach.
It's just, I know it's hard to talk about for me on some level, but it is the truth, right? I think it's the truth. So, okay. So the other thing I would bring up about this, I want to say other thing about antidepressants, which is just to throw it out as a thought experiment to see what you think here too, Daniel, which is it's based on sort of a funny psych researcher. It's probably something we'll talk about more later on at some other time too. But one of the things she says is that on some level, you can look at dopamine and serotonin as related to people's personalities.
Mm.
And she'll still say you have dopamine type people and you have serotonin type people.
Yeah, I've heard of this before.
And so the dopamine type person, maybe it's better to start there, is sort of what we might call like a more yang type if we were using like Chinese medical language. They're probably out doing more stuff. They want new experiences. They're probably more exploratory. There's a sort of a dopamine type personality type.
Mm-hmm.
They actually say dopamine people are also attracted to other people who are kind of dopamine as part of this theory. So people who are kind of like outgoing, explorative, they tend to be drawn to other people who are like this.
Mm.
But then they talk about the serotonin type person, and the serotonin type person is more, we might say, yin. They're more stable, but they're also somehow probably in a way more conservative, and they don't look for as much change, dynamism, new experience. They kind of like have a stability, but the stability has a kind of like a constancy to it. So the theory of this would be something like, to my mind, when you're giving people a lot of these serotonin reuptake inhibitors, you're flooding their brain with serotonin, you're knocking them into these more yin states. And they're getting to be more and more that way. As part of a cultural solution, you just put people into more and more yin states of being, where they get less questioning, they want less experience, they want less dynamism, they want less change, they get knocked into this other state of being.
Mm-hmm.
And you're kind of doing that maybe through like a neurotransmitter kind of way of inducing this kind of more yin state, which has a stability. So in that sense, the person's internal world fluctuates less, and they go through less of the maybe the internal torments of the instability of the internal world, which can be good for people if they need it. No judging. But on the other hand, what I have noticed in people who kind of keep taking this, and we're talking about people who take these things for like decades, is they keep trying to induce this, and these drugs tend to burn themselves out. You can't take these things forever. You have to keep either increasing dosages or trying other ways of inducing the same effect with like different possible changes in medication, right? I mean, this is just how this will tend to practically play itself out. My secular humanist friend sent me an article that was basically pointing out that eventually antidepressants stop working, and there's like research showing that, so there's a point of like kind of diminishing returns within this, unless you do what you were talking about, Daniel, do something else, try to fix this. But I just wanted to bring that point up because it does mean that in the way of trying to solve psychological suffering, you're just making people more and more yin, and you're kind of driving them more and more into these kind of internal states of being that are more yin,
right? And we could
and then it's harder to question, it's harder to challenge, it's harder because your mind is being skewed in a way not to want to do those things.
I think the right word, another word is sedation, right? You're being put in a more sedative type state. We're not saying yin is not good or yang is better. It's less of an outward movement.
Well, we're kind of semi saying that, at least I am, in the sense that you need some kind of fire.
Sure.
You need yang, you need inner fire. It's not a coincidence that like wisdom in the tantric tradition is associated with yang and fire, because that's how you develop that. You need a little burning, to get this. And Zen, sometimes they say like looking for wisdom is you feel like you've swallowed a hot iron filing and it's just in you kind of burning. That's what makes you want to like learn and do things. You have to feel some fire to do that. If you medicate this out, like, where are you? I mean, does that seem true to you though? Have you noticed that? Like, I've noticed that people who've been taking these things for years, one of my observations about them would be like, they just get more and more flat, and they get more and more their personality is not the same person as they were before. Now, maybe they're more internally stable, but they're not. They lost their yang, they lost their fire.
I would say people that I've treated that have been taking these for a while, I would agree with you on people who probably should be taking that medication because they need it. That could be the case. That I've seen that to be the case. Like, they probably really need it, not just because like they had a rough patch or. I don't even want to go that far. If I could edit this thing, I would edit that out. But I'm talking.
It is what it is. Yeah.
People who are definitely more on the mentally unstable side, dislike taking these medications for this very reason. They feel muted is the word that I've heard before.
Well, like I know, like, you know, people who have mania will talk that way.
Yeah. And so I think it's a more gross example. The more
you're talking about like lithium and shit like that, then
Depakote. You're
not necessarily talking about SSRIs necessarily.
Yeah.
But anyways, that's a medical conversation.
It's a medical conversation because it's dosing dependent, it's lifestyle dependent. You know, all these. There's a lot of other factors, but I think overall I agree. It's just to the degree to which I agree is going to be dependent on the strength and dosage of their medication. But that's the point, right? Is to get the patient back into their life so that they can produce and pay taxes and buy shit. And, you know, that's the point.
I mean, if you want to like be blunt about it, and we tend to be blunt. Yeah, that's part of the thing. That's what you're trying to solve, to get the person back to like kind of be a productive member of society.
Correct. That's right.
The thing about this is I didn't bring up patience because patience is kind of hard to judge because you don't really know that patient's like long-term personality all the time. You just know them as they come and see you now.
Right.
My feeling is I've had the experience of people I've known for years where I've been like, okay, I feel like this person's personality is changing. And sometimes they know it too on some level, you know, and they're in this kind of weird, I don't know, spiral or vicious cycle or something. Like they're in this thing. They need this for this internal stability. And maybe they do need it on some level, but it's also skewing their personality to become more and more kind of sedate. And maybe that also means compliance on some level.
Could be.
I don't know. I'm throwing it out there. So, all right. Tough conversation. Do you have to boogie?
Yeah, in about 2-3 minutes.
Okay. So then I guess the thing that gets to this, if we just summarize this section of this conversation before we bolt. Okay. So we're trying to have a hard conversation. Part of it's about like, okay, what is it that people actually think? And that's kind of a question mark too. And maybe what we're asking the listeners to do and the viewers is to go and say, okay, maybe do the exercise of trying to figure out what it is that we actually think. Because it's only by doing that we're going to know like what's underneath the surface. So we have to probably explore that. That's, I think, one of the things we're trying to say, right? And another part would be if we take it apart and if it's sort of like a biological materialist way of looking at the world, what you were saying, Daniel, most of these solutions are going to be biological material, which means you're going to get a lot of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then maybe the question that we're asking is something like, well, maybe it's worthwhile looking to see how are these things actually affecting me both in the positive and the negative sense, right? If you need them, you need them. But ultimately, there's also a reasonable question to say, well, how is this affecting me in my long term? Yeah. I guess that's what I have in mind about this. What do you think about it? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair summary. I mean, I feel like we've done our due diligence.
I got like one person who always we try to go personal. I have like two people that I always think about with this who've been on antidepressants for like extended periods of the time that I've known them. And I've watched them change. I've watched them stop being the young, lively, vibrant people they used to be. And I can remember, like, this is like pre-pandemic even, being out with one of them. And she said to me, "You've known me a long time." And I said, "Yep." And then she said, "Is my spirit dead?" Like very sincerely asking me. And I said, "Well, I don't know. I know you when I see you here. And I know that you love your child. And I know that there are things that you still feel things about. So I would say, no, I'm not going to tell the person their spirit's dead. That'd be a fucking weird thing to do. Yeah, I think it's dead as a doornail.
You're dead on the inside for sure.
Yeah,
you're a corpse.
It's a complete black hole. I don't even know why I associate with you. No, I'm not going to say that. But I was kind of like, yeah, okay, I guess that this obviously she has some recognition of something is changing.
Right.
Her. And I've seen it for a couple of people. So anyways, I guess that's part of what occurred to me. And I was in prepping this on a personal level. I was just thinking about people I know who are in the midst of this. Yeah. All right. Anyways.
So I think, maybe
tough episode.
Yeah. And I guess maybe in my kind of summation of this part of the episode, because this is going to be the second part, I'm going to cut these in two because they're just, our conversations are related, but not exactly on top of each other. That this part, will be titled Biological Problems and Solutions.
Okay.
And for me, I think you can have a biological problem, meaning the being, right, the structure, and but you can also have a spiritual problem, or we could say an energetic problem, which to me is psychological in nature also. Now there could be some physical structures that's wrong, that maybe you got into an accident, or you were born in a certain genetic influence or whatever. So there's this middle ground, right? That it's both and. However, if you only apply one solution, right? If you're only applying an energetic problem to somebody that has trauma in their life, that may not yield them what they need in the moment. Maybe that trauma for them is like pushing them over the edge, making them hyperreactive and depressive and all everything. They need some assistance. They might need some assistance, something to even them out. But then they have to go back and do work, right? Then they have to go back and kind of approach the psychological aspect, maybe do some work with their somatic body, right? And I think for me, this society, and it's probably Western society, I don't think it's just the United States in this particular conversation, doesn't provide the conversation for a more holistic view, a more holistic approach. Even the term holistic, from my perspective, being, kind of outside of the Western medical system, as are you, almost has a woo-woo kind of like connotation to it.
Part of the problem is if you have a biological material way of framing things, there's nothing fucking else besides that.
That's
anyways.
That's it.
So there's nothing else to talk about.
There's
all
nothing
you
else to
can
talk
really
about.
do is just frame everything in terms of these ways.
Correct.
And then, you can get like the Kala chakra benefits of these things, but you're always going to be just in that one space.
Correct.
Because there's no place else to go.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And newsflash, there is more colors than black and white,
Yeah.
And so this is my issue with this approach, is that there is not open conversation for other methods that may be more appropriate, actually, or at least valid in conjunction with. Take this, go home. And that's just not going to do it. Like, I'll say this, and then we can, whatever, like they had the guy, I think there's a show, I forgot what it's on. It's on Hulu, and it's about the pharmaceutical company, I think Purdue, and they, giving the, all the opioids knowingly to people, saying they weren't addictive when they knew they totally were, And so they had the maker, or the creator of this TV series was on Bill Maher, and he was talking, I forgot how the conversation came up. But he was saying that, like, people know, they knowingly gave people these medications that were bad for them, that were addictive. And even after this was known to be a problem, hospitals would put pressure on doctors to consistently prescribe these medications, knowing the downsides. Okay. Yeah. Why? So they wouldn't get bad reviews.
Oh, really?
They wouldn't get bad reviews.
Otherwise, the patients would give them bad reviews?
Online.
Oh, Jesus Christ. That's back to your, like, social media sucks things that you've been talking about since our first episode.
So it's this kind of thing, right? That there's just always something, there's always something to it that, like, okay, well, then maybe you got to deal with it. Not everybody is going to love their physician. And sometimes medicine is difficult, right? The best medicine often doesn't taste good. That's why they made the song, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because it's gross, and that's how it should be.
Mary Poppins, right?
Yeah. She's Mary Kay Poppins, which,
Mary Kay the Red Poppins.
That's right. So, I'm saying all of this because the balanced approach is rarely given to people. And the fact that conversation is lacking in the lexicon of treatment or understanding of how treatment should be for people, from my perspective, is the problem with this view.
Yeah, I mean, like, as we get, I agree with all of it. And I have to say, in the closing of the episode, in all honesty, this is one of the hardest ones for me to prep. It's, like, for whatever reason, this is hard shit for me to figure out how to talk about. Mm-hmm. Because I think, if I look at it honestly, I think it's like, there's a culture of confusion around all of this. It's very confused and confusing. And therefore, even when you're trying to, like, explicate it and talk about it, it ends up being, like, and some level obvious. Like, yeah, there's a lot of money to be made from drugging the shit out of people.
Yep.
Right. Obvious.
Yeah.
But there's some other part that's like just full of this obfuscation, confusion, and something. It's really weird. So anyways, that's I've been talking about this the whole episode, and I still feel that way. You know, we clarified the parts that are clarified, we clarified, but yeah, just full confession, as we like to confess on this G&T thing. Like, yeah, this is a very confusing subject matter, I think.
Yeah.
It's a hard culture to talk about, and it's like, okay, we're doing our best.
We're doing our best.
Yeah,
we're doing our best. Two court
thanks,
jesters.
Daniel. Like good conversation, and it trying to explicate it. I knew it was going to be like this. It'd be like us struggling through, going, okay, what do we even think about this?
Well, you know, I thought we did a pretty good job.
Yep. Good job by us.
If I do say so myself, I'm gonna pat myself on the back.
Okay, so good. Yeah,
awesome.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah,
It's a hell of a thing.
Yeah, Eric, as always, thank you so much for coming on.
Daniel.
Thank you to our listeners. You know, whatever podcast application you are using to listen to us, we definitely appreciate all of the feedback. We appreciate the listens. If you're checking us out on Apple, please leave us a review. It helps the show to grow. If you're watching the video on YouTube or on Spotify, what up? You know, and for everybody else, however you're taking us in, please feel free to share. And in fact, don't just feel free, feel encouraged.
feel even compelled.
Yeah, even compelled. Yeah. So yeah, that's it. As always, thank you everybody for listening. For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you in the next one. Peace.